Hi, I'm Kevin Golden, a member of the James Moore manufacturing team. I'm here with Mike Sibley, one of my partners and the leader of the James Moore manufacturing team. On today's episode, we're going to discuss manufacturing variances, including material, labor, overhead, and how we can understand and identify those problems and reduce costs. Now, we're going to also discuss the importance of overhead in cost management. So there's a lot to talk about in there, and Mike's going to help us talk to that. So, Mike, first, let's discuss components of inventory costs. What are those?
Sure, Kevin, and welcome everybody. This is always one of my most favorite conversations. I love talking about inventory and operations. This is a crossover of operations into finance to some degree, and how the two can work together to understand problems. But you're absolutely right. You got to first understand what are the components of inventory costs, because a lot of companies do things a little bit different. Some, it depends if you're small versus a large company, but the basic components are, of course, raw materials. You have your material costs. It could be raw materials, could be purchased parts, but that's the base, right? You start with your materials, and that's the whole thing with manufacturing. You're starting with something in its raw state and converting it to a final product, or at least final for whatever that customer needs, depending on where you are in the life cycle of production. So you get your material costs. You also have your direct labor. So these are people who are directly manufacturing. They're the assembly line workers or the machine operators, people who are physically transforming the raw materials into a finished good. And then, of course, there's manufacturing overhead. Manufacturing overhead are all the other indirect costs. So we talk about overhead. A lot of times there's confusion because we'll use the term overhead kind of broadly to mean every other cost. We're really focused on manufacturing overhead. So manufacturing overhead might be indirect labor, like your production supervisors, maybe your maintenance staff. It could be your rent and your utilities specific to the portion of the space that is used for manufacturing. So there's some cost allocations that might have to be considered. Insurance costs. Then, of course, you might have variable costs such as supplies. Manufacturing supplies that are not considered inventoriable, as an example. So what we do is we take all of those costs and we put it into our inventory, and we call that our inventoriable cost. And then when we sell that inventory, then we expense it off. So that way we've got a matching of our revenue and our costs, so we can know what's our gross margin. And oftentimes, this is where we're going to get into. Oftentimes, companies, manufacturers think, hey, I think I've got a 45% margin. Yet the financial statements say you've got a 40% margin or a 35% margin. Why is there that difference? But I think there's a lack of understanding in how to set up the financial statements. So they tell you what you need to know, and even what the financial statements are telling you. I've even seen plenty of situations where companies are able to run reports that say, here's my margin by product. So they're taking direct labor, indirect manufacturing overhead, and direct labor, and saying, hey, here's my margin. But that doesn't even match what's in your P&L. So something is flowing through your P&L that you're not setting up in your system. So you really have to start with what are the basics of your costs. So now you know how to start the measurement for them. And, it can get complicated for sure, but it also can be somewhat simplified in a way that can make sense. So management knows what to make sense of. And really what you have to do is train your management team to know what to look for, at least your supervisors. And it kind of depends on, what's the size of your company and how many layers of management are involved or beyond, say, the owner. So it's something that, you want to design it to not overcomplicate where you are in your life cycle as a business, but you want to get enough information so you know what you're looking at.
Right. And Mike, this may sound kind of obvious, but you mentioned, hey, make sure we're looking at all of our manufacturing overhead, really focusing on those types of costs. So one, why? I know that sounds kind of basic, but maybe why? And two, what are some of those other type of costs that maybe can creep in there that people typically, or manufacturers typically maybe include in that, or just kind of lump it all together with their manufacturing overhead costs?
Sure. Yeah. So let's look at that. It's a great question. So when we look, most companies are able, they really understand labor. They can manage labor. They see it. They know when there's overtime creeping in. The same thing with their material costs. They might have a better handle on it, but not always. So we'll talk about those two things in a minute when we start getting into variances. Then there's this bucket of manufacturing overhead. And like I said, I listed off a bunch of things, and it's not all inclusive. But there's also operating expenses called selling, general, administrative. And those are what we call kind of below the margin line. Those expenses, it might be your HR team, your accounting team, might be your sales team, your executive team. They're involved in running the business as a whole. They're not an indirect cost of manufacturing. And sometimes what we see are things like the CEO, who used to be, maybe the owner, who used to be deeply involved, but is no longer really involved in production on a day-to-day basis, but really managing the business. Their salary is still included in overhead. Well, that's not necessarily the case. We also see research and development get included sometimes in overhead. Engineering time related to R&D. So what we want to do is we don't want to burden your inventory costs with R&D costs or people who are not involved. So we need to keep them separated out. Now, your pricing model is a different story. Your pricing model needs to get you through your net income, and pricing model is a whole different game. Right. It does include your margin and what you're trying to get there and your costs, but it also includes making sure you're covering your SG&A expenses, interest, other expenses. So you come out with a net profit of 10 to 20%, let's just say, somewhere in that realm. So it's really important to understand your costing methodology and your costs that are driving into overhead versus costs that need to be excluded. Because when you go, sometimes I've heard clients say, I'm going to price myself out of the market. Well, you might if you're including wrong costs and you're increasing costs and not even realizing why. So we got to really look at those things and understand what's really driving your cost factors.
Yeah, I think that's important. That's a key point there. What is driving all of that? Not your pricing necessarily for your entire business, but what's really driving, and more importantly, whenever you find that out and you can hone in on that, what can you do? Well, you can make sure you get the intended output, which goes back to the home point of driving the value of your company. Also, we've said on this, show and this podcast several times that, really focusing on, well, here's what operationally is happening. What do the numbers tell me that? And kind of building that bridge between the two. I'm not, maybe you're a manufacturer, you're not a accounting person or whatnot, like maybe we are. But again, those are tools that can tell you when there's something going awry, which leads us really into variances, right? And that's what you're driving. Hey, if we can really focus on these manufacturing aspects, when I think I'm getting that profit margin of 45%, but it's really coming out at 35%, that there's something wrong. That's kind of helping us hone in on what those are. So tell us a little bit about that. What kind of, what that expectation is of what we think we're getting versus what's spitting out on the other end. What are those manufacturing variances, and what does it even actually mean to have a variance?
Right. Yeah, that's a great question. And just to first finish up on that last thought, to your point, we are actually in the process right now working with one manufacturing client. We're redesigning their P&L. So we're working with the management team saying, what information do you need? Now, some of it we can easily tell. When you look at it, you can see what's there and what's not there. Their cost allocations are complicated or a little, they need adjusting. Their P&L just doesn't tell them anything. You can't look at it and make decisions, nor can you take any of the operational reports and actually make sense of it from that bridge. So we're making these things happen so that way we can give the CEO and the management team the right information. And that's what you ultimately have to do, is say, what information do I need? Now, as we jump into variances, what are variances? It's really not, a variance is as simple as saying, I have a budget. I think my raw material is going to cost $1, but in reality, when I pay for it, it costs me $1.20. So now we have a 20-cent variance in that particular case. So really, when we work on manufacturing variances, we can have material variances, we can have direct labor variances, and of course, we can have overhead variances. And those three variances are really, really important to understand the difference, because from a budgeting standpoint, and often you see this in standard costing systems, and we'll talk a little bit more about that, but you set your products up, your inventory costs based on a standard. Well, your standard should approximate what you actually think it takes to make it. In other words, it takes $1 of raw materials, $2 of labor, and $3 of overhead. Obviously, I just made those numbers up. That's what we think our inventory should cost us to make, is that $6. However, when we start running our P&L, we notice that our labor costs us about $2.20 per item. Our overhead is at $3.30, and our materials at 90 cents. So we got a positive variance. It's costing us less than material than we thought. Maybe we got a negotiated price down or volume discounts or something. But our labor, what's going on? Did we get inefficient? What's going on in our overhead? Our variable costs going up more than we think they should? What's going on there? So these variances tell us something is out of the ordinary. We expected this and we're getting that. And we want to measure those things because that tells us something. It's similar to using a budget, but it's budgeting your inventory. Now, it could be that we did a bad job budgeting. That happens. Maybe we had some faulty data. Maybe things changed after we set that budget. And we got to take a look at it and say, hey, is this a new normal? Why? Can we explain it? I'm a big proponent of saying that numbers tell a story. Now, of course, when you listen to any TV ad or, numbers can be made to make any story you want, I suppose. But let's pretend for a minute that the numbers here are really telling a story. Now, you may not know what the story is, which is where you got to dig in. And that's where understanding what's happening from a variance standpoint can tell you something. And so that's why we focus so much on these variances.
Well, and obviously I think human nature would be, okay, I've got a negative variance. Something's not working as well as I thought it would be or costing more for whatever reason. Obviously, you want to focus on those areas and explore the why behind that. What about positive? I mean, is there a reason why if I have too large of maybe a positive variance, now that should also potentially raise a red flag?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. And I work with another client where we look at both positive and negative variances as an example of one situation. And the reason is we want to understand what's happening. Maybe our standards are too high. Maybe we're going to get better margins than we think because, one of the nice things about, understanding your inventory costs and setting up that is you can actually prepare a budget based on your inventory costs for, let's say 2025, we're getting into budgeting season. So we can say, hey, we're going to forecast revenues of X based on these products and however you forecast your revenues. And we know these products cost X, so we can actually build out a margin. Well, if we're using a standard cost or a budgeted cost, it's actually higher than reality. We're gonna make our budget look worse, and then we're gonna make decisions that may not be good for the business. So if we have positive variance, we want to know, is this a new normal? Why is this positive? Are we recording information incorrectly? What happened that created our labor variance? Are we getting more efficient? Did we come up with some new processes that we can actually quantify that we're doing something better? Material costs, did we negotiate something? So yeah, we want to understand the why so we can build it into our future understanding. We can modify our standards, because if that becomes a new norm, let's just say for labor, $1.80 per unit is where it should be, not the $2 we thought. Well, now we can set the expectation, build our standards around that, building our training mechanisms around that, building our understanding of scrap rates around that, time for rework meaning. So those are the kind of things that we can understand the why and reset. So that way we don't climb back up into, hey, we're holding you to a standard of, 15 minutes to make this product, even though it only takes 8. Well, you're sitting there going, well, what's my, as long as I get it done in 15 minutes, I'm good. No, if we can do it at a faster rate, that's more throughput, that's more capacity. We want to hold you accountable to that, not to something else.
Sure. Yeah. Well, that's very good. And so now I think let's talk a little bit about, okay, now we talked about variances, we talked about the different costs and so forth. Okay, well, how do I track those? Are there any, best practices or things like that to tracking those and monitoring those variances to come up with, to even identify them? Or is it kind of everyone, has got a slightly different method or so forth?
Yeah. And so this is going to follow the life cycle as a company grows. At some point, companies will start off, maybe they're really small and they're really only worried about material costs, the expense they're direct. They're not really worried about really getting inventory necessarily accurate because they're small enough where they control everything. They see their margins, they understand their prices. The owners are writing all the checks out, they're signing all the payroll checks, so on and so on. So they got a really good handle. But as you grow, you start getting into these ERP systems, and managing actual costs through these systems can get a little bit more complicated. So you start moving to a standard cost system. And that can, in the standard cost, typically what you'll see is maybe actual cost for materials, maybe actual cost for labor hours, and a standard labor rate and a standard overhead rate. Okay. Right. So that's kind of the most basic form. Then you can grow into maybe standard material costs and standard labor hours. And so what you do from there, let's just take the most simplistic, because this is what a lot of companies in that $10 to $40 million range have, is maybe actual hours with a standard rate and a standard overhead rate. What we can do is we can set up your P&L to drive, here's your direct labor, actual payroll that you paid during a time frame versus how much we've capitalized into inventory, and we can see that difference. The same with our overhead. We can bucketize, put it in a bucket. I think I just created a new word there, bucketize. We can create a bucket of, here's your overhead costs, here's what we put in inventory, and see if we've got a difference. In an ideal world, they match exactly. But if they don't, that's a difference. That's a variance. So then on our P&L, we can see, do we have substantial variances or are they really minimal? And we can see that as we go by type, and we can make adjustments for that. We can dig in and understand, because in a lot of manufacturers, there's a certain amount of costs that are fixed, and there's some costs that are variable. And depending on the manufacturer, the type of product, the production process, that can change. But we might have fixed rental costs. We might have fixed supervisor labor, depending on are they salaried or not, those kind of things. And then we might have some variable costs like manufacturing supplies or overtime that is happening. Well, if we see that, now we can understand what's going on and why. Well, if our revenue is staying flat, why are we incurring more overtime now than we did before? Why are we buying more manufacturing supplies now than we did before? What's going on there? So the standard costing system set up with the P&L in the right way will allow us to look at a P&L and see variances right away.
Right.
We can see them. And, now we can understand what we need to do with then we can understand, okay, why are we having these variances, and what do we need to do about them? So it drives almost immediate action. So, setting up a standard costing system is similar to setting up a budget.
Right.
Now, let's just say you're like, hey, no, we're going to do actual. Okay. Well, then and that gets a little harder when you're dealing with overhead capitalization and things like that. But let's just say we're just, everything's actual. What you can do then is look at your margin. What's happening with your margin on a monthly basis? Because your margin if your costs are consistent with your revenue, we can look at your gross margin and say, is that consistent? If it is, that's great. We can also look at, if we create the right P&L, we can create a trailing 3 months, trailing 6 months, trailing 12 months in comparison to last year and say, are our costs staying about where they should be? Are variable costs increasing like they should as a percent? Are fixed costs staying? So there's a number of things we can do to look at those, even if we're not set up in a standard costing system, to make sure. So our gross margin is always kind of our guiding light. And then, like I said, does our gross margin match what we think we should? We're doing these proposals. We're doing customer quotes. Are we getting what we think we should?
Right.
And there's a number of data analytics tools and things like that you can do to kind of dump and slice and dice. But we can set up a P&L, do a lot of work, and then use Excel and other tools to create some systems there.
Yeah. And I'm just like everything else, I'm pretty sure that AI will continue to make that more and more efficient, easier and easier to get the data you need quicker over time. And now it's a matter of, okay, well, what are we going to do with that? Right. And so that leads us right into, okay, well, now we've got these variances, we've got these problems and so forth. Right. Now we've got to look at, whether it's reducing cost or, hey, that person who is taking twice as long when they should be taking half the time and making the widget or whatever it may be. What are some strategies to help maybe control that or reduce those costs, whether it be overhead or other costs, when we notice this from our variances and from our analysis?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great question. And a lot of manufacturers are familiar with, lean manufacturing, Six Sigma, the tools and methodologies. At the end of the day, it's about eliminating waste in the processes,
Right.
eliminating steps, streamlining process, and then continuous improvement after that. So, to start out, it's walking through the process, working with subject matter experts, meaning the people who are actually doing the work, to say, where's the waste? Where are we building up inventory that we shouldn't be? What's our bottlenecks? What are extra steps that we're taking? Try to look at that and really try to get it as streamlined as you can, and then continuously improve and get employee suggestions, build Kaizen teams. Try to make yourself better as you go, and you can do it maybe step by step. Depends on what your production process is. You can look at your machining times. You can look at setup times. Where is it that you tend to bottleneck down? As you're doing this, I'm still a big fan of setting up a budgeting what we think our costs are. And oftentimes you probably already have it in that you're doing quotes for customers. So you know with these, and even if you're a contract manufacturer, for example, so you've got you don't have really your own product, you can still set up budgets. You can still set up timeframes or expectations. So, for example, you might have a unique need from a customer. Well, you set up and you gave them a quote based on some engineering schematics to say, hey, here's the materials we're going to need. Here's the labor I think it's going to. You can still use that to set up a budget for that particular product and monitor against it. And so then you're using those tools to see how can you do things a little bit better. There's not a one size fits all to looking at these things, but I can say understanding and budgeting your costs, understanding your production costs are a great way to start. Setting up your P&L so you can see the information that you need to make decisions is a great start. And then using that to determine where do we spend our time? Where do we improve? How can we eliminate waste? It might be scrap that we might be looking to eliminate. Maybe we've got too much scrap on a particular scenario. Maybe we've got a problem with some tooling where the tooling it needs maintenance. We've talked about, I've had examples where maintenance programs are not necessarily followed. Had one situation where a client had a machine down for a long period of time because they didn't have a maintenance program, and it hurt them really, really bad from that standpoint. So, if the tool is not cutting the way it should, then why isn't it? And maybe it needs to be maintained so that way it gets back to where you go. So that way your scrap rates are low.
Right. Well, and I think I like what you said. There's a lot in there. I mean, there's a lot of different tools and all that you can use. This can be as complicated or sometimes as simple, like using and talking to your people, talk to the people that do that job day in, day out, right? I mean, these are all different tools to use. And I like that because you're, like you said, no one size fits all as far as gaining this data or solving any of these variances that may arise, right? So there's a lot of different tools in here that you can use.
Absolutely.
So now let's put this maybe into some real life examples. You mentioned this several times and so forth. Hey, we've had a company, had a client that did this or someone that did that and so forth. Do you have any maybe examples like that, that you could share with us? Obviously, we won't share any names or specifics there, but at least some examples. I think it's best to put it in terms of a real life example of how it may apply to a manufacturer.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. One comes to mind on the forefront that's always a favorite story of mine. The system we were using, we were really more monitoring margins because the costing systems weren't as sophisticated. So we would use margins. We'd use material percentage. We'd use labor overhead percentages to monitor over time. And we'd look at a trailing 12 or trailing 24 even and do analytics and then look at margins. And this one company, we noticed each month that their material cost percentage was going, so their margin was going down and their material cost percentage was going up over time, and didn't have a really good answer from management, didn't have a really good answer. And so I did some analytics and went back, and all of a sudden I noticed that our garbage bill was going up, our trash bill. And I was like, well, that's kind of weird. So I got the tickets from the trash company because they paid based on weight in this particular trash piece, and noticed that the weights were going up big time. So I got with management, and turned out, and I don't know why it didn't come to the forefront sooner. I can't remember anymore. Did not come to the forefront. They had something going wrong in their process, and they were scrapping a significant amount of their product, which was big, heavy stuff. Right. And the only reason it came out was because of looking at our just doing an analytic on our trash, and it was going up in dollars all of a sudden. And so looking at that bill, I was able to dig down into it, get the tickets, see the weight. And when I talked to the management team, they're like, oh yeah, we've been having a problem, but they didn't quantify how significant it was. So they weren't addressing it quickly enough. So they went and addressed it, and we saw it actually drop back. Right. And their margins came back, material cost percentage came back, things like that. So we've also had, we've got situations where clients where, I gave you a maintenance example. That's a real life example where there was another one where, maintenance. So we started a maintenance program to make sure that it wasn't creating. So we saw these different things that were going wrong. And, what I see from really successful companies is they manage these things. They manage their overhead. They look at it. They set their P&Ls up in a way that they can make heads or tails out of it, so they can see negative trends. And then they monitor their variances, and they don't just stop with saying, oh, we got a variance. They dig into them and understand, why do we have a variance? Right. So why do we look at these things? So they look at that so they can control their costs. Because it's not easy to just continue. Obviously right after COVID for a while, we saw prices going up like crazy in a lot of situations. Well, companies aren't taking price increases very well anymore. So you got to really kind of control your costs. And so one of the ways to do that is make sure you understand what's going on in your production process, and monitor it, and then set it up against your expectations to make sure that it's working the way that you think.
Yeah. No, I think that's a great point. Those are some great examples. And I think, kind of a takeaway as we kind of wrap up here for me is, again, we talk about lots of times building value in your company, right? Not only building value in making sure you're more efficient, that you're charging appropriately, that you're making the profits that you think that you're making, right? And solidifying that. And when there are problems, but also think long-term, being able to explain that to someone else. Maybe it's the next generation that we've talked about, transfers of ownership or an ownership change or something in the future, right? And succession and what that looks like, right? Well, being able to explain that to them, whether that's someone that's intimately familiar with your business or an outsider looking in, just is going to add that much more comfort level and value to that transaction as it is on a day-to-day basis when you're in there working operationally each and every day. So again, there's a lot of great reasons all in here as to why this is important and why this should be tracked now. These kind of things should be looked at now and with regularity. It's not just a one time throughout the year. Depending on what you're looking at, maybe it's a weekly or a monthly or even quarterly, but definitely more often than annually to help monitor these things, because otherwise you're kind of playing catch up rather than being proactive to address those types. Mike, any other final takeaways?
Yeah, I think just you summarized it well. And I think key thing is, don't overcomplicate it. Don't make it so difficult that you can't get anything out of it. Sure. Use the systems that you have. Even simple systems like QuickBooks with an inventory add-on can be useful. It's just designing it in a way that you get the information and then do something with it. Look at it and then do something with it to help improve your operations at the end of the day. That's the game plan.
Yeah. Well, Mike, thanks so much for all your input, all your insight of this. Thank you, everyone, for listening. As always, there's a lot in here. There's a lot packed in there. So if you have any questions at all, go talk to a professional. Maybe that's us. Maybe you have a professional, but make sure you're talking about this. This is something you're looking at today. That way you can gain some better insight into how you're functioning, or at the very least that you're functioning the way you think you are. So thanks again. Thanks everybody for listening, and we'll see y'all next month.
To learn more about James Moore & Company's manufacturing services, go to jmco.com. And don't forget to subscribe to our More on Manufacturing series to receive updates when new videos and podcasts are released. If you'd like to be a guest, or if there's a topic you'd like to see covered on a future episode, contact us on our website. You can also follow us on social media for more news as the landscape on manufacturing continues to rapidly evolve.